Hello and welcome to the Scholar Circle, scholarcircle.org. I'm Maria Armoudian. In today's program, after another brutal police killing of an unarmed black man, George Floyd, a massive wave of protest has spread across the United States with solidarity demonstrations across much of the world. How was this killing representative of a broader set of injustices in American life? How might the protests influence change in the United States? Our contributing host, Professor David Meyer, seeks answers with University of Maryland professors Dana Fisher and Rashawn Ray.
I'm David S. Meyer, a political sociologist from the University of California, Irvine, and I'm privileged to be with you today on the Scholar Circle to talk about what we've all been talking about: nationwide protests against racialized police violence. Those demonstrations may be about much more as well. On May 25th, 2020, George Floyd, a 46-year-old black man, was killed by a white police officer in Minneapolis, Minnesota. The officer knelt on Floyd's throat for 8 minutes and 46 seconds while 3 other peace officers stood by. Floyd, unarmed and fully restrained, was suspected of trying to pass a counterfeit $20 bill. Several bystanders videotaped the killing, and the video was quickly spread across social media. The next day, demonstrations began for indictments against the implicated police officers, against racialized political violence, and for some kind of movement toward a more just society. The demonstration started in Minneapolis, but soon spread quickly across the United States in cities large and small, and even in other countries. Note that this is all happening in the context of a global pandemic, which has claimed more than 100,000 lives in America, and in the administration of an unpopular president who has periodically urged police to be tougher with suspected miscreants. Police departments deployed a range of strategies in policing the protests. Some endorsed the call for an end to police brutality, taking Colin Kaepernick-style knees on asphalt, not someone's throat. Some employed harsh military-style tactics, donning riot gear and using tear gas, pepper spray, and rubber bullets. Some departments did both. Everyone in politics and out is talking about the protests. Some point to police violence, while others focus on incidents of vandalism and looting, which have dotted some of the protests. And some people are talking about racial equality. Tonight we meet on what will be the 10th night of protest to try to get a sense of what's behind these protests, what they mean, and where all of this will end. We're fortunate to have 2 scholars from the University of Maryland who are exceptionally well positioned to offer some insight. Rashawn Ray is currently a David M. Rubenstein Fellow at the Brookings Institution. He's also an associate professor. No, he's a full professor of sociology and executive director of the Lab for Applied Social Science Research at the University of Maryland, College Park. Professor Ray has published a raft of academic articles on race, the police, and the family, and another set of pieces that you may have seen in outlets like the New York Times, Newsweek, and the Washington Post. Some titles: Can Cameras Stop the Killings? If Only He Hadn't Worn the Hoodie, and Why Police Kill Black Males with Impunity. Most recently, this week, he published a blog entry: Bad Apples Come from Rotten Trees in Policing. Dana R. Fisher is a professor of sociology and the director of the Program for Society and the Environment at the University of Maryland. She has been a pioneer in studying protest movements by leading teams of young researchers out into the field of demonstrations and conducting systematic surveys. She is author of National Governance and the Global Climate Change Regime, and of Activism, Inc., a study of the reliance on young canvassers to fund social change, among other titles. Her newest book, American Resistance, tells the story of the wave of activism that began with the inauguration of Donald Trump and was published by Columbia University Press in November. You may have seen her on MSNBC, CNN, and PBS News explaining just what's going on. She's also written in the popular press, appearing in Washington Post, Time, and Politico, among other places. I'd like to start with you, Rashawn. Was there something unusual about the killing of George Floyd that loosed all of this?
David, thank you for having me on. I'm excited to have this conversation with you and especially my colleague in Maryland, Dana Fisher. Yes, I do think that there's something unique about George Floyd. And I think what it is that there's something about seeing a person die in real time, particularly die at the, in this case, knee of a police officer, that really matters to people. People can no longer deny that it happens. But I also think that it is something about seeing a person, in this case, a black man, laying on the ground, handcuffed underneath the knee of a police officer, hearing him scream out for his mother, who died nearly 2 years prior, almost basically on the same day, yelling out for his mother and then take his last breath. I mean, the inhumanity that exists with that, the immoral, the fact that this was so immoral to a lot of people, I think really captures this particular moment on why it matters so much and why it's impacting people.
I can think of lots of other names of victims of racial violence, sometimes from police, sometimes from other people. This year, we've heard about Breonna Taylor. We've heard about Ahmaud Arbery. In previous years, the names Eric Garner, Trayvon Martin, Tamir Rice, Rodney King, Amadou Diallo have reached national attention. But does every instance of police violence or racialized policing get recognized? What makes some of these killings stand out?
Yeah, I think to your point, there are so many unnamed martyrs that oftentimes people in the Black community know that when it goes national, it's typically because there is a video attached to it. I think we have to be very clear that technology matters, that being able to capture these moments on camera phones matter. I think one of the reasons why people were calling what happened to George Floyd a lynching is because lynching is symbolically similar to what we've seen. That seeing George Floyd take his last breath was like people from a collective memory standpoint, seeing the casket, seeing Emmett Till's body in that casket in the 1950s is reminiscent of what Billie Holiday called strange fruit hanging from trees, which were Black people hanging up, strung up on trees while people watched a lynching. And I think that's part of the symbolism around lynching, is that lynchings were oftentimes well attended. People watched them. People literally used it as a picnic, kind of to pick a N-word, if you will. That's one of the origins of that word. So when people think about what happened to George Floyd, we see that in a continuum. And to your point, you mentioned a few other examples. What happened to Christian Cooper in Central Park with Amy Cooper often starts a continuum of police violence that goes from Christian Cooper and his incident through Ahmaud Arbery to George Floyd. And I think in all of these incidents, we saw them on camera, and the frequency by which they happened, coupled with what happened to Breonna Taylor in Louisville, highlights this continuum of police violence that continues to collide on Black bodies.
Okay, Rashawn. So the officer who killed George Floyd has been charged with second-degree murder. The 3 officers who stood by have been charged with accessory to second-degree murder. They're going to be now dealt with by the criminal justice system. Does that mean it's fixed? Is it okay now?
You know, that's a good question. I think it's important. So I have a different perspective on this question. And I think it's part of a silver lining because I do work on policing. To your point, the fact that these officers were arrested so quickly and the fact that they've been charged so quickly is actually unprecedented. I mean, I've been studying policing for nearly a decade, collecting data. I've worked with dozens of police departments around the country with the virtual reality work that we've been doing at the University of Maryland. And one thing I know is that officers being arrested like this doesn't happen often. We simply have to go back 5 years ago when, after Freddie Gray was killed in Baltimore, Marilyn Mosby, the district attorney, stood up and brought forth charges against those officers. People cheered. At that moment, it was unprecedented. But you know what? We fast forward 5 years. None of those officers were convicted. And pretty much all of them are back out on the street, continuing to be bad apples that proliferate and rot in the tree. And so this moment is different because of the speed at which they were fired, the fact that charges were brought in, the fact that they brought in the state. So now the attorney general is coming in to bring forth charges. This does make this moment unique. I think the same way when we look at Ahmaud Arbery, that after the video came out, 3 people have been charged with his murder. Not only that, but they brought in the state and the federal level. With Amy Cooper in Central Park, she got fired from her job and her dog was taken for animal cruelty. These are big changes that didn't happen even 5 years ago. But what's key is without the technology, without the video, we have to question, will we even be in this moment and will we even know about these incidents?
Is it only the killing of Black men that racialized policing results in, or is there something else that's going on? I mean, is there a bad system that results in something other than the killing of Black men?
Yeah, I definitely think so. So, I mean, the research I've done, I think first it's important for people to just realize some statistics on this. First, black people are 3.5 times more likely than whites to be killed by police when they're not attacking or have a weapon. That's like George Floyd. Black teenagers are 21 times more likely than white teenagers to be killed by police. That's 12-year-old Tamir Rice, who I guess was like a preteen, playing with a toy gun in the park. That's like Antoine Rose in Pittsburgh. And then we also know that every 40 hours, a black person is killed by a police officer in the United States. That might be like Corinne Gaines. That might be like Breonna Taylor. And then we also know that 1 out of every 1,000 black people can expect to die due to police violence. So Officer Chauvin in Minneapolis had nearly 20 police misconduct allegations, nearly 20, some of which had came up before the grand jury, some of which had came up when Amy Klobuchar was the district attorney. And when we put all this together, what it shows me, similar to the officer with Tamir Rice and Antoine Rose, both of those officers had worked for other police departments and had been quote unquote let go, which means if they weren't fired, that the Fraternal Order of Police told them to resign before they were fired. And then in the case of Tamir Rice, the officer who killed him then went on to work for another police department after being fired from Cleveland. So this speaks to how bad apples come from rotten trees. And we have to be very honest that in the United States, the rotten tree is the legacy of the way that structural racism is imbued within policing. I think it's two quick examples. First, law enforcement in the US originated in slave patrols. That means when black people were fleeing plantations, that there were people who would go try to capture them. That's the origins of law enforcement in the United States. We also know that the KKK firmly infiltrated law enforcement when it came about. And then finally, we know from FBI reports that over the past decade, that white nationalists and white supremacist organizations have viewed law enforcement as an occupation, as a profession, where they can firmly integrate themselves and proliferate these bad apples across the rotten tree.
I've seen speakers in the wake of the demonstrations begin by announcing that they are a black man or married to a black man or father of black boys. Like Keisha Lance Bottoms, the mayor of Atlanta, began her comments by saying, "I am the mother of black boys." What's this mean? Why do they do that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. You know, I think part of it is being in solidarity. I think particularly for political leaders like Keisha Lance Bottoms. And I grew up in Atlanta, very much connected with people that she's connected with. And part of that is throwing an olive branch, particularly during the past week or so, with people who are protesting. It's saying, I empathize with you, I'm in solidarity with you. But what I think it also speaks to is the fact that people who have black boys, have raised black boys, who have been black boys, who are now men, are hurting in ways that's difficult for broader America to make sense of. And I mean, I can even say, you know, as the father of two black boys that are 8 and 9, I read something recently that really touched me that highlights this. It said, having a black son makes you pray differently. And, you know, honestly, that touched me, that as a researcher who approaches this work, and I approach it pretty objectively, and even in this recent piece, I got a bit more personal than I normally do. But I found that it's resonating with people because I think people look at those of us who are professors, they look at us with PhDs. They're like, your life is great. They see our lives as being synonymous. And one thing I know is that when I leave work, that my life is sometimes more similar to the black man who picks up my trash than it is to the professor who's in the office next door to me who's white. And that is the reality of being black in America. And so while I normally don't get that personal because, you know, we're trained to just view the work as the work, but telling part of my story, I think, helped people. And the praying statement is highlighting that I worry about the day. I think this is what Keisha Lance Bottoms is getting at. You know, I really worry about the day when my 2 boys go from cute to criminal. And it happens instantly. Like right now, they're cute kids. People see them, they're kids. You know, they're smart kids. Like they just made straight A's in school, where daddy helped them make straight A's in school because we're like doing this homeschool thing. Like school ended yesterday. Like I think I was more excited than they were. And I think about that. Like they're sharp kids. They're smart. You know, they're nice kids. They're good kids. But yet and still, no matter if they make straight A's in school, no matter if their dad is a professor, no matter if their mom is a nurse practitioner, Our class status can't protect them from the stereotypes that goes onto their bodies as they grow. And I think for most kids, well, most parents, when they see their kids, they're like, yeah, I want my kids to be tall, or, I want them to grow to be big and strong, regardless if they're boys or girls. But when you have Black kids, particularly Black boys, it's a worry. Like, I worry if my oldest kid is going to be 13 and look like he's 16, which means in a lot of white people's minds, he's going to look like he's 21. And we know, like, when they killed 12-year-old Tamir Rice, one of the things that the officer said is, I thought he was older. When George Zimmerman killed Trayvon Martin, he said, I thought he was older. And that highlights research, which shows that people view Black boys as older than what they are. So these are the things that manifest that when you have Black kids, particularly Black boys in America, that even as a professor who studies this, and as much as I try to protect them, it's difficult in what I say to them. And it's difficult having to come to the realization that no matter what I do, that I can't protect them from the likelihood of police violence or violence more broadly that might be impacting Black communities.
You are listening to The Scholar Circle, scholarcircle.org. I'm Maria Armoudian, and our contributing host, David Meyer, is discussing the mass protests across America arising from the police killing of Mr. George Floyd with University of Maryland professors Rashawn Ray and Dana Fisher.
The piece that you recently published, Bad Apples, was powerfully written, and it meant a lot to me to read it, and I would commend all the listeners to take a look at it. But in that piece, you reveal that you have been stopped at least once, on an average of at least once a year throughout your life. Why did you share that, and what does that mean?
Yeah, David, that's a good question. I mean, I rarely ever share that. And I actually think this is, definitely the first time I've ever written it. I think the first thing is, as an academic, again, we're trained to do research for the sake of doing research, and our personal lives aren't supposed to come in. It's interesting, being at Brookings, they have a slightly different style. And even though it's very policy-based and nonpartisan, they've learned through algorithms and other things that people like personal stories coming in. So they've been pushing me for months to share part of my story. And I felt like it was a good time to do it, because I think I'm one of those people, and there are many people, many of my friends who I know and other people who I think people look at and they think, oh, Rashawn would never be George Floyd. Rashawn would never be Ahmaud Arbery. But I would be, and could have been, like, based on my experiences. To your point, as I'm about to turn 40, I realized that I've been stopped more times than my age. And that moment kind of did something to me to reflect on it. And I started, reflecting once again on all the times I've been stopped. The time when I remember in college driving home from University of Memphis to Murfreesboro, Tennessee, which is by Nashville in my hometown. And it's a 3.5 hour drive. And I was speeding. I was going fast. And I got pulled over. I was speeding. And I got pulled over. And it wasn't the fact that I was speeding and I got a ticket. That would have been fine for me. Okay, I got a ticket. I was speeding. I paid a ticket. But in this particular county, if you're stopped, and it happened to be in a construction zone, so the speed limit dropped down. So not only was I speeding, but then it dropped down. I had to go to court. And when I went to court, there was a judge in this county who didn't even have a law degree, who I watched him sitting in court tell people who came up for DUI, for domestic abuse, for other things, who were white, he just let them go with a warning. And every time a Black person came up, he's literally sent them to jail. And I came up, and I remember I had a 4.0 as my freshman years of college. I remember I had on a suit. I told him who I was. I told him what I did, and it made the situation worse. And he was getting ready to put me in jail for a speeding ticket for, I think it was like up to a week. And it just so happened, because I have police officers in my family, my great uncle was first Black chief of police in my hometown. I said, actually, I have due process. Like, we can actually table this for me to come back, and we talk about this case in sentencing. Like, I can defer this. And he got so upset that I knew the legalities of it. In short, we had to hire a lawyer. My family had to spend thousands of dollars that they did not have to get me out of a speeding ticket in this racist county. And it just so happened that one of my best friends from college, who is still one of my closest friends today, Laura Peeverhouse, that she happened to be from that county. And she said, oh yeah, the judge lives on one side of me, and the lawyer who you need to get who helps Black people get out of situations like this lives on the other side of me. So I'm going to give you his number. Tell your family to call him and he can help you out. Thousands of dollars later, I got out of that. One of my other friends today, was my college roommate, was talking to me. And we were having this conversation because part of what happens in these moments that people also don't realize is not only do you deal with the trauma of that incident that just happened. When your friends and family contact you, they then relive all the moments you've had with them and all the moments they've had. So my friend from college, who was a banking executive, needed to vent because he hadn't had time to do that. He lives by himself. He pretty much only interacts with people he works with. And he said something really powerful that I want to read. It was a quote that I felt like was very, very powerful. He said, "We rarely have the space to express our true humanity and our true feeling." And he said, "I can't walk around like my inside feels. I can't walk around like my inside feels," meaning I'm so angry, I'm so frustrated, I'm so sad. But I know that as a Black man, that if I express these emotions, it could actually lead to me ending up just like George Floyd. And so, I think I shared it as a way to hopefully help people realize that we cannot outclass racism. That Christian Cooper being a graduate of Harvard doesn't matter, just like me being a professor in Maryland doesn't matter. It should. And I think that's one of the ways that I hope white people are dealing with this moment is that white people primarily view racism as class, but racism, while it's highly linked with class, there are other aspects that are social and cultural that play out that our class status cannot get us past.
I'd like to come back to you, Rashawn. Are there measures that police could take that would make things better? Things like limiting immunity, body cams, bias training, diversifying the police force. Does any of this stuff matter?
I think it does. So I'll highlight a few things that I think will help people from a policy standpoint. First thing, we need comprehensive data. So we know how many people are killed by the police. We know how many people are killed by jellyfish every year. Like CDC actually collects that. I had one of the research assistants and postdocs that work with me. He had been analyzing all the various things the CDC collects. But we don't collect data on how many people are killed by the police. Senator Cory Booker has been presenting this. Why is this important? Well, look, I'm talking to academics with you all. Data are always important. And so we like data. But more importantly for this topic, comprehensive data reporting decreases police killings by 25% because policing is actually very data driven. And when they have the data, they actually change and make better decisions because at the end of the day, they really follow best practices and they want themselves and the people they're interacting with to get home safely. Second thing is, I think implicit bias trainings matter. I've probably done at this point. I've been doing a lot of them over the past 5 to 10 years. A lot. And I've done it with dozens of police departments around the country, Department of Homeland Security, the U.S. military, and they work similar to body-worn cameras. We've written about them. The problem is they're still on the bad apple side. It focuses on the individual. We need to shift to the rotten tree. Comprehensive data does that. Another thing that does that is we need to ensure that police officers who are fired, who are terminated for misconduct, or who resign underneath a case where it's alleged that they've engaged in misconduct, those people should not be able to work in law enforcement again. George Floyd, Tamir Rice, and Antoine Rose might still be alive today. Finally, and this is the big one that I think that I've been pushing, is that we need to restructure civilian payouts for police misconduct. Eventually, George Floyd's family is going to get a large civil payout. It's going to be millions of dollars, and taxpayer money is going to pay that in Minneapolis. So that means George Floyd's family is going to be paid back their taxpayer money for their loved one being dehumanized and murdered in the street in front of people underneath the knee of a police officer. We need to shift civil payouts to police department insurances. Why is that important? Well, now all of a sudden, it helps deal with qualified immunity. Even though police officers will be sued, it doesn't mean that they're going to pay out their pocket because I don't think they're going to have the money, nor am I unsure if that is the proper recourse. But what it does is that it makes it like a medical model. We go to the doctor, we go have surgery, and something goes wrong. Heaven forbid, they take out the wrong organ. They leave a cloth in us when they sew us up for something we had done. We're going to have a malpractice suit. And when the hospital gets their new premium and it increases, they get a list of all the cases that cost them more money. And so if we do that with policing, a police chief can say, you know what, Chauvin, on his 5th police misconduct allegation, they can say, you know what, you're costing us way too much money. We're going to have to let you go. that gives police chiefs the ability to weed this out. Why is this important? Because in the city of Chicago alone, they've paid out over $600 million in police misconduct lawsuits over the past 20 years. Imagine if that money went to schools, work infrastructure, and health. I mean, we might not be seeing the disparities in Chicago, and we definitely wouldn't be seeing the amount of crime on the south side of Chicago because education and work are highly correlated with crime. You give people equitable work and education, and you decrease crime.
Policing was the shift, Barack Obama, a black man as president, to Donald Trump, who is not matter.
Yeah, I think so. And I think it matters in one big way. It matters by federal oversight. So when Jeff Sessions took over the Department of Justice, he implemented a policy that he wasn't going to bring forth any consent decree against any police department. That was a signal to police officers and police departments that it was like the Wild Wild West, that there wasn't going to be any oversight for what they've done. The research I've done shows that federal oversight in terms of consent decrees and federal investigations is typically the time in which we see the most progress in policing. So Baltimore is under a consent decree. Ferguson is coming out of a consent decree. Prince George's County has been under 2 consent decrees. That's when they made the most change. The first big one was diversifying their police force. The second was renegotiating their use of force policy. So, and even though things keep happening, like an officer just in Prince George's County, Maryland, just shot and killed someone who was in the backseat of a police car. That's an example of a bad apple. That officer who did that, who's black, by the way, who I know very well, had been involved in 2 other officer-involved shootings. And just based on my own interaction with him, should not have been on the streets as a police officer. And I think these are the sort of things that happen. So the Department of Justice oversight is a big one. If Joe Biden wins in November, expect a series of consent decrees to come out from the Department of Justice where they have been stalling. Because the other thing people have to realize is even though there are certain parts of federal government where there are lifetime, life staffers who, regardless of the political party in office they stay in. And of course, as Dana can talk about, I mean, that's changing with the EPA and other sort of things now under Trump, even more so. But under the Department of Justice, it's one of those agencies that definitely fluctuates a lot based on the political party that's in office. So all of the lawyers who were working in DOJ under Obama have left and new ones have came in. And if Biden wins, it's going to be another switch in the opposite direction.
Do you think all these demonstrations matter?
I think so. I'm curious what Dana says. And I think they matter because we're dealing with 2 pandemics. We're dealing with COVID-19, which hopefully we eventually figure out and get a vaccine for, and it becomes part of our life. And then we also are dealing with racism, which is the pandemic we've never fully dealt with in this country or even around the world. And so I think these protests are mattering because, as MLK said, they are the language of the unheard. And I think we've already seen some movement with them. I think partly because the officers have been charged is a big thing. Like one of the people in Minneapolis and in the state of Minnesota said, this is what the public wants, suggesting that what people are doing in the street matters. I think now it has to transition from protest in the street to sitting at tables negotiating, but there are politicians working on these policies. And so, I definitely think that these protests are mattering. I think it's so many of them. Obviously, similar to what MLK said, we don't want to necessarily see them destructing property and being violent and hurting people. But since the riot is the language of the unheard, it's similar to a teenager I heard in Baltimore 5 years ago. They asked her, why were they, doing this? And she said, well, we tried to kneel and y'all didn't listen to us. We tried to have a simple conversation. You didn't listen. So it takes us to tear some stuff up for us to get your attention, for you to listen. And I think it's a profound statement. She was probably about 16, 17 years old. I heard another same statement from a teenager in Minneapolis. And I also think that this generation, similar to the generation of the 50s and 60s, that there's something about them where they imagined a different America, that their parents told them that America was going to be different. And especially as they grew up under Obama, they were like, you all told us we weren't going to deal with racism anymore. We're still dealing with it. You all didn't fix it. We're going to do it our own way, and we're going to deal with it.
Thank you very much, Rashawn. And thank you for coming and spending time with us. I'm David S. Meyer, a political sociologist from the University of California, Irvine, and I'm privileged to be with you today on the Scholar Circle to talk about nationwide protests against racialized police violence. And I'm going to shift to Dana now. Dana R. Fisher is a professor of sociology and the director of the Program for Society and the Environment at the University of Maryland. She has been a pioneer in studying protest movements by leading teams of young researchers out into the field of demonstrations and conducting systematic surveys. She is author of National Governance and the Global Climate Change Regime and of Activism, Inc., a study of the reliance on young canvassers to fund social change, among other titles. Her newest book, American Resistance, tells the story of the wave of activism that began with the inauguration of Donald Trump. Dana, your new book, American Resistance, documents the growth of a wave of demonstrations and actions in opposition to the Trump administration. What's the resistance?
Well, David, I build on a very influential work by you, as well as Sid Taro. And basically, I believe that the resistance is a counter movement that basically can be defined by activists and organizations and individuals who are challenging the Trump administration and its policies. Because it's a counter movement, it means that it's possible to bring together somewhat competitive movements, disparate movements that have been working across the left over, many years. And it basically brings them together to work together because they have a common enemy.
Dana, you and a couple of other people like Michael Haney have been heroic pioneers in taking surveys at demonstrations and systematically sampling and giving surveys to demonstrators in the process. What's special about that method? What do you get out of that you wouldn't get otherwise?
What we get out of the method is that we actually know we have a random sample of who's in the crowd rather than the accounts that we get in the media, where the media are intentionally in the crowd to tell a story, right? So they're looking for the dramatic or interesting story in the crowd. They're not looking to get a sense of the average of the crowd. Whereas when we do the work, we're basically looking to get a random sample of who's out there so we get a better sense of the crowd broadly. So we collected data at the March for Our Lives, where there was 850,000 people in the streets of Washington, D.C. The sample was only a couple hundred, but because we were through all of the different parts of the crowd, we're able to get a sense of how many young people were there, how many of them were motivated to participate because of gun violence, how many of them were involved in other types of political activities. And I think it really tells us a lot more about what's going on. And it actually gives us a sense of what it means for movements when we understand who's in these crowds and don't just look at these large, images of people who are yelling in the streets, because we don't really understand very much without having a good sense of the data.
So about the resistance, is there a big story underneath all these demonstrations? Is there something that connects them all?
There certainly is. The original idea around the project was just that there were these large-scale protest events that were happening, and they were around many different issues. And I was really interested in understanding if there was a thread that wove throughout them. And what I was able to find that was really interesting is while there were these large-scale, very large protest events that happened very close together in Washington, D.C. and around the country, we were able to see the fact that the people who were coming out were first of all motivated by a diversity of issues to participate. And there were a lot of the same people coming out. First, they came out for the Women's March in 2017. Then they came out for the March for Science. Then they came out for the People's Climate March. Then they came out for the March for Racial Justice. And the list goes on. And so we see this amazing repeat participant. What's remarkable about that is that the participants were really quite different from what we'd seen in protest events in the past. They were predominantly middle-aged, highly educated white women, and historically participants in protests tend to be more male than female, or there's parity there, but we now finally are starting to see women dominating more. And it's not important, as I frequently have people in the general public who say the gender doesn't matter, and it doesn't matter to some degree, but it does matter in that what I then did is followed the people who marched in the streets and followed them through the midterm elections to see what they did after they marched in the streets. And I think that's where the resistance really matters, because not only are they participating in this kind of performative type of peaceful protest that is about collective identity building, but then they go back into their communities and they do all of these different activities towards the elections in 2018. And I think that's the really interesting finding that we have here, is that people march, but they do so much more. They march and then they go out and they register voters and they canvass and they call people and they get involved in running for local community boards. And And that means that we see people getting involved by marching in the street. And particularly, we see a lot of women going back into their communities and getting more politically involved and starting to take leadership positions. And that's probably one of the reasons we see more women running for office in this 2020 wave than we've ever seen before.
And the massive demonstrations in Washington, D.C. or elsewhere are far more visible than the day-to-day work of knocking on doors and canvassing or going to town meetings.
Yeah, I mean, and what's interesting is it used to be that these massive demonstrations took years to organize and involved a lot of organizational infrastructure in communities to identify ways to get enough people and get them on buses and drive them in, and in many cases go to, Washington, D.C. was the target in many cases. And these days, protest really has changed. So it's very much this kind of performative opportunity because we have all this technology now. And because many organizations run substantially over, digitally, so they're not actually about meetings anymore. What it basically means is that these events get called and the idea is to turn out a lot of people for, a sense of, taking the temperature of how many people are interested in an issue. And what it is used to channel the, what I think of as the energy and outrage that we see in the streets that gets people out in the streets initially, channeling them into other activities. And that's where organizations come in. Even though, what I find in the book is that organizations were not identified by people in the streets as being particularly important. We had the lowest percentage of people identifying with organizations that I've ever seen in the 20 years I've been surveying protesters. What's really interesting is, what it means is that people were they were members of organizations and they worked with them around the midterm elections. They just didn't have that brand loyalty, which is a whole other side to this question of how, our civic lives are changing in America. Because it means, it's partially due to the fact that people are working with organizations that now have changed the way they do membership. So much is digital and so much is not about face-to-face meetings and getting people involved in activities that are embedded in these local community groups.
So let me see if I'm getting this right. I think what you're saying is that in ancient times, like the 1960s or 70s or 80s or 90s, the organizing took place and then the big demonstrations followed. And now we're operating in a flipped model where the big demonstrations come and then the face-to-face organizing at the local level follows. Is that right?
Exactly. I mean, and what's really interesting about it is that we see that in these truncated timelines that are used for organizing protests. So, I mean, the first, the Women's March 2017, which was the largest day of protests in U.S. history. Let's see, it took place in January and people started organizing for it in November. By the time we get to the March for Our Lives in 2018, they do that whole thing in 6 weeks. And then Families Belong Together, which is in summer of 2018, they organize multi-site mobilization that takes place in 12 days.
Amazing.
Obviously, you couldn't have done that if there weren't digital technology connecting people, right? Because you can't do that if you have to get people to go into meetings and you have to figure out all of the organizational stuff at the local level to get people in. But instead now it's really more networked.
So you mentioned marches for science, for women, for climate, for immigrants, for truth, for tax justice, health. You didn't mention all of them, but some of them and many others. How does this new wave of protest against racialized police violence fit in? Or does it fit in? Is it continuous with this whole wave of the resistance that you've described?
That is a very good question, David. One thing I can say is that in the sample of the data that I collected was also the March for Racial Justice. It was the smallest of the protest events where we collected data. And some of it may have been that at the time, a lot of people weren't as motivated by the issue, but there were also, as I talk about in the book, the organizers chose intentionally not to bring in a lot of the larger organizations that might have mobilized more people to participate. So it was right during the time that the Take a Knee campaign had gotten a lot of attention and the president was tweeting angry things about that and the vice president was leaving football games. So I actually expected it would be much bigger. So that brings us to this moment now. And I'm not sure the degree to which what we're seeing in the streets right now is part of the resistance. What I can tell you is, I just got back, I was collecting data downtown in Washington, D.C. at a die-in that was being organized. It was a peaceful protest. And one of the things that was really, notable is that we saw people who came out who were mobilized and motivated to participate, not just because of police violence, not just because of the killing of an unarmed Black man, but that certainly motivated a lot of people. But there were a lot of people who were out there in the crowds because of Donald Trump and the policies of the Trump administration. And I'm certainly the fact that the administration has supported taking arms against citizens in the United States who are protesting peacefully is motivating more people to join in. In fact, a lot of the organizations that I studied as part of the American Resistance Project have all called, made announcements in solidarity with the activists who are marching, and have in many cases suggested that their members should join people in the streets as part of the solidarity. I mean, the other thing I would just say is that, so there's no question there is a connection here. I have to look at the data more to say the degree to which it is. And what I would be looking for is the overlapping motivations, because we collect data on that. And then also the degree to which the people who are participating now have participated before in these other events. Because one of the things that I noted around for the book is that people were coming out not just for women's issues, but also for other issues. And there was this interesting overlapping of people coming out again and again. And I don't know if that's the case yet. But what I do know that's very interesting, and it speaks to the question you asked Rashawn before, is that one of the things we've seen in the data, because I've been collecting these motivational data about what motivates people to participate, and we ask questions that run the gamut, and it's actually based on categories that came out of data that Rashawn and I collected together at the Women's March 2017. And the categories break down into many different issues, but they include racial justice and Black Lives Matter. And one of the things that's remarkable to me is that the issues of racial justice and Black Lives Matter are not top motivations for people who participated in these other protests and the resistance, but they were for March for Racial Justice, of course, but they were certainly important and actually increasing over time, which means that even though we have people who have been getting involved in organizations and activism that end up being predominantly middle-aged white women, they're increasingly concerned about these issues. And now they had the horror of having to watch a Black man be murdered when he was unarmed in Minneapolis. And I think that really struck a chord for them, because I think that increasingly people who have been involved across the left have recognized that there are there's structural racism and there's inequality in our country that partially is connected to racial inequality. And then we see this horrific act, and we also see the way that the president responds. And all of that, I think, has helped to mobilize a lot of people who were engaged with the resistance through these other protests to get involved and channel their outrage into these issues specifically.
I've been watching critics of the current round of demonstrations haul out Martin Luther King, suggesting that today's demonstrators don't live up to that image, that there's a good kind of protester and a bad kind. Does this make any sense?
Not if you've read about tactical insurgency in the civil rights movement, as I know you have, David, right? I mean, why are they doing that? Because some people are very uncomfortable with anything that is confrontational. When I was doing the book tour that ended early because of the virus, I gave talks to activists in all the different towns I went to, and I went to a lot of purple places. And one of the things that I found really interesting was that I talked about the fact that the resistance was predominantly highly educated, middle-aged white women. And, one of the things that we need to think about as we come to an election is that is not representative of the left, and is certainly not representative of what is needed for a Democrat to win the White House. So, I ended kind of with this question about the role that people of color play in the resistance. And frequently I would have people of color stand up and respond to me, and they said, well, there's something really frustrating about the fact that when, middle-aged white ladies with pink hats block traffic, they end up on CNN. And when young Black people block traffic because somebody was murdered, they are called a riot. And I think that there is certainly some response by certain people that is due to race and thinking about their discomfort with confrontation. I mean, we've been living in a remarkable time in that we've had protests for so long right now, and it's been almost entirely peaceful. So we've not seen a lot of tear gas, And we haven't seen a lot of, we certainly haven't seen a lot of pepper spray in the crowds or rubber bullets. Didn't see any of that until, the past 10 days. So what's really interesting is now we're seeing this where people are really using protests as an outsider tactic rather than as an insider tactic to help to mobilize people to do stuff in the institutional system. And I think that makes people uncomfortable.
So there's maybe a standard model of policing that you saw at the millions of demonstrations you went to in the previous 3 years?
I was just going to say, the funny thing is that before today, when I was downtown, or before all of these marches or the protests began recently, the only time I'd seen a tank in recent years was that they had a tank at the Families Belong Together protest. The tank was actually used to spray the crowd because it was a really hot day. So they had hooked it up to a fire hydrant and they were providing water because it was a hot summer day in Washington, D.C. So that was the tank's purpose, versus now we have tanks with people walking around with machine guns in Washington, D.C. Very different.
So what's going to come of all this, Dana?
I don't think that we're going to see everybody calm down until the election. I think that, the emperor clearly has no clothes, and I think that a lot of people on the left recognize it now. And I think it's great because, a lot of people said that people woke up after the 2016 election. Well, I think that we've got a lot of people on the left who are woke and are in the crowd and are marching. And I can tell you from looking at the demographics, I don't have the data, analyzed yet, but looking at the demographics from people who were in the crowd today, we see a really intersectional group of people who are standing in solidarity.
So people woke up after the 2016 election and now they've had their second or third cup of coffee and are pretty energized. Thank you. Again, I'd like to thank Dana Fisher and Rashawn Ray, both of the University of Maryland. You can find Rashawn's recent blog post on his website, and I'd urge you to follow him on Twitter. His handle is @SociologistRay. And Dana Fisher's new book, American Resistance, should be available everywhere. She's a prolific tweeter as well, and I'd urge you to follow her. And her handle is Fisher_Dana R. I'm David S. Meyer from the University of California, Irvine, thanking our listeners as well as our guests.